Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really happy to be introducing the first talk today, which will be Eva Vivalt talking about academic research on global priorities. So Eva Vivalt is an assistant professor in the economics faculty at the University of Toronto. And more recently, she is the director of the Global Priorities Institute at the University of Oxford. Eva's own research focuses on applied microeconomics, so thinking about cash transfers, for instance, or improving decision-making, for instance, through the use of forecasts. But today, I think we'll be hearing about what academic research can do specifically on this question of how to figure out how to do the most good. And hopefully also we'll get to hear about Eva's plans for GPI as well. I'll just make a couple of notes. One is that there will be a Q&A after this talk, and you can submit questions, you're encouraged to submit questions on the Swapcard app. And then secondly, Eva will be giving an office hours session immediately after this talk. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Eva.
Thanks. So I'm going to be making the case for academic research. And I know that among the effective altruism community, it is pretty rare for somebody to think that academic research is the most impactful thing that you can do. But I think this is in part based on a misunderstanding of the role of academic research and what it can contribute to global priorities research more broadly. So in this talk, I'm going to make the case for it. I'll talk through the strengths and also the challenges. And throughout, I will contrast it with non-academic work on global priorities. So first, some preliminaries. If I'm going to be talking about academic research and about global priorities research, it's important to have some definitions of these things. Now, there's no one universally agreed upon definition of global priorities research, but the definition I'll use for this talk is that global priorities research is research that informs an agent who's seeking to do the most good. And obviously, this is not going to be the same as academic research. There's going to be some global priorities research which doesn't really fall within the purview of academic research, such as very shallow investigations. And also, there's going to be a lot of academic research that doesn't speak at all to global priorities. I would say that if I have to characterize academic research, the most salient features are perhaps that it's extremely rigorous and correspondingly takes a lot of time. Now, there is some research that is done that I would consider academic research outside of academia. So you may be working in some other institute but still be doing academic research. Nonetheless, I'm going to be broadly referring to this kind of research as academic research, okay? Now, also, I want to distinguish between academic research and publishable research. It's not the case that academic research will always lead to publications. A lot of the time, it won't. So this is not to say that, we're seeking to just sort of publish a lot of things. No, that's not, it's great to publish, but there's going to be a lot of good academic research that didn't meet some editors' subjective criteria of what counts as important, right? To me, the most defining features of academic research is that it's highly credible and increases our understanding in an important way of some field, okay? And I like this kind of definition because it means that we can include some things like carefully done descriptive work, right? Which probably should be included. At the same time, it's true that more often academic research is extremely rigorous. And there's some reasons for this if you think about it. Like if a field is very saturated and you're trying to nonetheless go further and increase our understanding still further, you're probably going to do that by going to the edge of what we know and trying really, really hard and doing really, really rigorous research and making some new finding there. Whereas in areas that are newer areas, there's not much of a developed literature, Perhaps you can do less rigorous research, like maybe you've got some descriptive statistics that you know are kind of noisy, but they're still the best out there. That would still make a sizable contribution to the literature. Okay? So taking a step back, the role of academic research really is in part about pushing this frontier of knowledge and building understanding, building a solid foundation from which other researchers can also then go and do their own work. So if we think about the circle being the current frontier of knowledge in a field, you might be working really, really hard trying to push that frontier, and your own research project, one day, if you're lucky, there, you've increased the overall scope of what is known about the world. Okay? And you're trying to do this in a rigorous way so it withstands this test of time so that other researchers can build on it and it serves as a foundation. And the role of academic research in being very rigorous is in part because it's just hard to know things, okay? If it were easy to know things, you wouldn't need to spend a lot of time, you wouldn't need to put in all that effort, gain all that expertise in order to make a contribution. Though it's important to note that what's easy to know changes over time, right? I mean, we all now learn calculus in school. We know about things like expected utility theory. Tools like these had to be invented. Somebody actually had to be the first to sit down and try to figure some things out. And so it's easy ex post to say, well, I could have figured out expected utility theory on my own. But actually, we're always building on previous knowledge and trying to push the frontier out. And it can be very hard to build something new from where one stands. Okay? So I want to talk through some of the difficulties that might arise when doing research. And I'm going to be talking about it from the perspective of my own discipline, which is economics. So I think, though, some of these examples are going to speak to research in other fields as well. So one thing about economics is if you're doing empirical work, a lot of results are massively underpowered. So what does this mean? Well, statistical power, essentially you want it to be as high as possible so that if you've got a lot of statistical power, you can be confident that if an effect exists, you'll be able to observe it in your tests. Okay? Here is just a graph of the economics literature and how much power there is there. And you don't even need to, so the conventional levels of power are 0.8. There's nothing magic about 0.8. But you can see a lot of these studies are falling way below that, way close to zero, okay? Study results are massively underpowered in general. This also means that if you do find any statistically significant effect, it's more likely to be a false positive. Now, I'm a Bayesian, but this still applies to Bayesians, right? You're going to have really wide, credible intervals. Here's another figure, this one from Schoenfeld and Ioannidis. They have this cute thing, everything both causes and cures cancer. So you've got different kinds of food and whether certain studies show that it helped prevent cancer or potentially caused cancer, right? So each red dot is one medical study. And you can see, here's a study for wine saying that it causes, this one protects against cancer. Here's one that says it causes cancer. They're all over the board in general, okay? There's a wide range of possible results. Now, I tried to do the same thing for global development. These are intervention outcome combinations. So you have things like conditional cash transfers, what's the effect of conditional cash transfers on attendance, on enrollment. You've got deworming, bed nets, unconditional cash transfers, a variety of programs here, right? And these are results from meta-analyses. These are in terms of the standardized mean difference. So these are in terms of standard deviations. You can also think of this as effect sizes if you prefer that language. And these are box plots. So you get the median in that intervention outcome combination, the interquartile range, and maximum and minimum values. And the dots are outliers even beyond those. So what you can see here is that, again, results vary quite a bit. If you were to ask me what's the effect of a deworming program, I would say, well, which deworming program? Where? On which sample? Was it randomized by individual or by cluster? There's a lot more information that I would want to know. So this is just to give some indication that it can be really hard to know things very well. Here's another figure from Silberzan et al. What they did was they gave people the exact same data set, and they said, analyze this data. And you're free to analyze it how you want, but have it be, a credible analysis. Do your best. And this is reported in terms of odds ratios. So an odds ratio, usually it's used when you've got a treatment group and a control group and you're comparing them. An odds ratio of 1 would be you've got the same propensity in both of these cases for some particular outcome. An odds ratio of 2 would be you've got double the chance in one group than the other, roughly speaking. And so here you have things that range from below 1 to above 1 and even above 2. So again, there's quite a range here. It might look like they're tightly together because there's this scale problem with some large confidence intervals on the last couple of them. But they actually cover quite a substantial range. I mean, there's a difference between 100% and 200%, right? So this is using the exact same data, just choices in analysis are different. So we've seen, studies can be very underpowered. They can vary a lot. There's a lot of heterogeneity in treatment effects. And even with the same data set, seemingly benign analytic choices can really result in very different estimates. Okay, so that's for empirical work. What about theoretical work? Is that situation any better? Well, again, I'm going to be drawing on my own field of economics, where there's a distinction between pure theory and applied theory. So if you're in another field, I think you can probably adapt this to your own field. But in economics, at least, pure theory is just math, okay? So things like game theory, mechanism design. If you have made some assumptions, your conclusion is going to follow from those assumptions. It's going to always be correct in that sense. The challenge is that it might not be useful. It might not actually reflect any kind of real state of affairs in the world, okay? People may not want to use it for when they're thinking sort of conceptually about the problems that they face. Applied theory, on the other hand, makes more applied models of the world, which you can hopefully fit to data and see how well they apply. And what I would love to be able to tell you is that here is some work that, gathered 10,000 different theories across different fields and tested them all against real data and showed that, in general, theory applies or it doesn't apply. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that because there's no such study. I would love for there to be such a study. Somebody should do that study. But what we instead have is people looking at certain types of questions, certain sets of models, and seeing whether those models seemed to work well or not. There, I think the evidence is quite mixed. There are some models that did work very well. There are some that really did not, okay? So a bit of a mixed bag here. There's a more general point about the benefits, theoretically, of theory, which is that it can provide a framework for thinking of different problems. So, for example, we throw around these terms like Nash equilibrium or principal-agent problem. These are concepts that somebody had to develop, right, and that have entered the common discourse and inform us when we're thinking about new problems. We can try to think about whether it fits one of these categories and whether there's something that we know by virtue of this existing model. And the best theories are going to sound obvious ex post, which makes it really hard to argue for the benefits of them because you're like, yeah, but that's obvious. That's hindsight bias. But I think that it does take a lot of effort to get there in the first instance. And for some support of this, I would recommend you to check out the scientific backgrounds that are written for Nobel Prize winners, for example, because these are pretty detailed documents. Like in econ, at least, you've got these 50-page plus single-space documents just outlining what were people's contributions, actually. And they are great to read because, first of all, they're very impressive, but I think it becomes clear that these people's accomplishments would not have been possible without really extensive expertise, both deep and across fields sometimes, okay? And there are also many examples of really careful, rigorous research overturning previously commonly held beliefs. So, I'd already written up this when I went to look and try to find examples and found a sentence that almost exactly matched what I had already written. This is from Tirol's Nobel Prize scientific background. Often his rigorous thinking has overturned previous conventional wisdom. That's exactly illustrating the point, that academic research is very rigorous and that it can overturn conventional beliefs, okay? So, taking a step back, now we have talked through both global priorities research a bit and academic research. How can we relate the two of them? And what does academic research have to contribute specifically to global priorities research? And the broad general point that you can take from the earlier bit is that academics will often make this trade-off to have more rigorous work and be extremely careful, even if it takes more time, but then have the higher chance of actually giving the correct answer to a problem or having a more general theory that can be applied in many settings. I would say there's room for both academic and non-academic research in global priorities research. They're just different kinds of research that are targeting different parts of the space. And here's an example of the space. Here you've got rigor on the x-axis and impact on the y-axis. And it would be great if academic work reached those dots in the top right. You can think of a dot here as a new finding, a new discovery, some kind of result, okay? It would be great and most impactful if academic work got those dots up there. Of course, most research, most academic research is probably going to fall down here, but I think there are some opportunities for very high impact academic work. I also think that there are some opportunities for academic work to have an impact across the whole spectrum, both directly and indirectly. Why do I say directly? Well, remember what I was saying earlier about how it's in some fields, there's completely no existing literature out there, and making some kind of contribution, even if it's a little bit less rigorous, is still actually cutting edge for where the field is at. Okay, that would be an example of directly having a fairly low rigor, potentially high impact, let's hope high impact, research result, but still sort of be within the purview of academic research. There's also, of course, indirect effects, which I'll talk through in the following slides. But I think the image that comes to mind the most when we're thinking about the drawbacks of academic work is that since it can take a lot of time, you might be better off pursuing less rigorous research and have a higher impact that way. So for example, perhaps if you're striving towards that bright blue dot there, you would have been better off trying to go for those orange dots instead. You could have discovered all of those things, had a much higher impact. Going for the more academic research in this case would be a mistake, right? Now I mentioned spillovers, and I do think that there are a lot of spillovers from academic work to other organizations and other kinds of research that is done. A lot of the work done at OpenPhil, GiveWell, etc., relies very heavily on academic research. Academic research can serve as an input, as a tool. There are also some spillovers in the other direction as well. Sometimes less rigorous work can inspire more rigorous work. It gets people thinking, and somebody sits down and tries to write a paper on it, tries to test out, say somebody reads a post on the EA forum, and they go and they say, okay, let me try to more explicitly, more formally model this. That's a possibility. I do think that it is less likely to move in this direction, in part because if you think about rigorous research is taking a lot of time, you're going to want to make sure that if you do pursue rigorous research on a particular topic, you're really well justified in doing that. You'll have a higher bar for taking on a new project, basically. It's a lot easier to take some existing rigorous research result and say, okay, I'm going to apply this, than to try to go in the other direction. But that's just my intuition. There are spillovers in both directions. The other kind of spillover I think is actually incredibly important is within a person. So remember I'm saying that academic research requires a lot of expertise. It's very rigorous research. Sometimes you might work on a topic that is pretty low impact, high rigor, and just working on that project will help you skill up, will give you more tools, and enable you to later on make a discovery that is higher impact, that you might not have been able to do if you hadn't done that preliminary work that was of little consequence. So sometimes the benefits of academic research can take a long time to materialize. And I think that this is actually a really important part of it, because I do think that some of these higher impact items on the academically rigorous side, you really do need a lot of expertise, a lot of background knowledge, and go really, really deep in order to be able to attain them. That said, of course, you can develop expertise in any field, right? You can become really, really good at doing less rigorous work and be able to do that, more efficiently as well, do better jobs at that as well. Okay, and more broadly speaking, the benefits of academic research do tend to accrue over longer time horizons. In particular, if you think some of the benefits are, again, building up that foundation of knowledge so that other people can build upon it, well, it's going to take other people time to build upon it, and for then other people to build upon what they did, and other people to build upon what they did. Personally, I think if you have short AI timelines, probably academic work is not for you. I don't know, I've been working on a project since 2016 myself, and it's a pretty common timeline, I think, for a project in this area. But I also think that it's not just that the benefits take time to arrive, but they continue to arrive potentially for long periods of time as well. They can persist. So I would make the analogy between academia and it's an institution. Institutions often are slow-moving, but persist over long times, and can affect culture, can affect many different things, have a lot of indirect effects. That's the way I would tend to think of academia. And there's other kinds of spillovers I haven't really touched upon here. Academic work, of course, will help in training the next generation. If you're an academic, you can try to inspire more students to do more impactful work. You can try to give them the tools to do that work. You can also generate more interest in certain key questions amongst other researchers. There's definitely a multiplier effect whereby if you sort of show something's an interesting question and you can do good research on that question, other people are going to say, oh, well, that's interesting. I want to engage with that research. I want to also try to see what I can say about that question. And it's in part because we're in the space of generating ideas. Another Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer, had this thought of ideas as a public good that people could use simultaneously. Nobody's, there's not one person can just sort of hold on to an idea. Everybody has access to that idea and can use it. We're all here because of ideas, right? So ideas can be very powerful, and academic work can contribute to the public discourse like that. I think that's actually a very powerful part of it. Okay, so switching gears a bit. I want to say a few words about the Global Priorities Institute and my plans for it. So the Global Priorities Institute is an academic research institute at the University of Oxford. It is an interdisciplinary institute between philosophy and economics, although we're trying to also expand into psychology. It was founded not too long ago, about 5 years ago, slightly more. And the founding director, Professor Hilary Graves, is a very accomplished philosopher at the University of Oxford. I would say the philosophy side started to develop first, and there has been some growth of the econ side as well. Presently, we're up to 23 people at GPI, including 6 postdocs. There's also a number of senior research affiliates who are based at other institutions often, but still contribute to the general research program, attend workshops, attend seminars, and 6 research scholars. There's an incredibly active visitors program. This is more active than any other institution I've been at. In June, for example, there's going to be 25 people visiting, which sort of swamps the number of people formerly at GPI. There's regular workshops, like also in June, there is a fairly large conference with parallel sessions, drawing over 200 faculty and students. There's a fellowship program that draws a lot of mostly PhD students. And other students also attending the Open Student Workshop. And if you think about it, for an institute that was founded really not very long ago, this is kind of incredible, right? I mean, this is just telling you about the people there, but still, this shows there's a lot of interest, latent pent-up interest in doing this kind of work. So I think that's very promising as a signal for the future. And the other thing I can say is that the pre-doc placement has been fantastic, right? So these are pre-docs who have gone on to some PhD programs in economics at MIT, Chicago, and Northwestern. Those are top placements for an economics pre-docs program. I think any institution would be very proud to have that kind of placement record. So if you are considering a pre-doc at some point, do consider GPI. It's got a great placement record for that. Okay. So talking more specifically about my own plans for it, I first want to caveat this by saying we're going to be having some ongoing conversations over the next while, and I don't want to sort of front run those conversations, right? There's going to be an annual retreat as normal and some other strategy meetings and discussions, because those could lead to other insights. These are just my thoughts as of today, right now, okay? And the other thing I want to flag before getting into this is that the philosophy and economics side are just very different from one another. They're different disciplines, they have different norms, they require different kinds of things. You know, since econ started a little bit later, still at a more formative stage at GPI, and I'm an economist myself, it's going to be, I think, natural for me to focus on that a little bit more, right? Trying to build that up, because the philosophy side is doing quite well. So what are these plans generally speaking? Well, I had a blog post and also an EA forum post I'd like to expand upon here, roughly under these headers, that I would like there to be, you know, continued research on decision making under uncertainty, to increase empirical research, continue to build up a community of researchers, explore other fields, and mentor students and early career researchers. So let me say a little bit more about each of these. So with regards to research on decision-making under uncertainty, I'd previously tried to describe just how difficult it is to know something, right? To know something really confidently. And from my perspective, you know, if we find it really difficult to know something even in a very well-studied area in global development, you can imagine how much harder it will be to think, you know, for example, farther out into the future. Yet at the same time, we still need to make decisions. Now, GPI has a robust tradition of doing work in this area. For example, Hilary Graves had done a lot of work on cluelessness, right? She leads that literature. And other people as well have looked a little bit at unawareness and how to do robust decision making. I think that's an important area to continue to focus on. I also think it's important to do some empirical research. So GPI to date has focused mostly on theory, which is great, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, I think, you know, it's important to test falsifiable hypotheses once in a while and to make sure you're sort of grounded in reality. And there are relevant hypotheses that could be tested. For example, what is the decay rate over time of the accuracy of forecasts? A lot of people these days are interested in using forecasting in their own work. You know, it can help to fill gaps where you don't have data yet, but you do have forecasts. Some of my own work as well relates to forecasting, so I might be biased, but this seems like a very tractable research problem that would be beneficial to know something about. And GPI has a number of strong empirical researchers, so great, let's leverage that. More broadly, I would like to continue to build a community of researchers outside of GPI as well, because you know, GPI, I think, has punched above its weight and has some great researchers, but of course there are many more researchers in the world who are not based at GPI, and it would be great to help people sort of, you know, grow where they're planted or whatnot, right? And so I would love to encourage other researchers at other institutions to work on interesting topics within global priorities research, and we can collaborate on certain projects. And over the coming months, I think this is going to be a large part of my day job, right? Having a lot of conversations with people to try to find areas of overlap, try to match make between GPI researchers who can also work on projects together and outside researchers. If you're interested in collaborating in some way, if you're interested in contributing to the research agenda, please do get in touch. I'll share some contact info at the end, but also, you know, you can just reach out and email me, whatever is easiest for you. But I'm very excited to chat to other academics here. We're also, as I say, exploring, expanding to other kinds of topic areas, such as psychology. Up to this point, I would say that GPI has focused primarily on long-termism. I think there will continue to be some focus on long-termism, especially on the philosophy side. On the econ side, there's still some things that could be tested that relate to it, such as, you know, think of the decay of forecasts, for example. But then I think there's other areas that we're also thinking of exploring on top of that. Some of them I think could potentially be pretty influential. Yeah, I have AI mentioned here, yeah, we're just trying to branch out and expand the topics on which we're working. Okay. Now, with regards to students and early career researchers, the thing is that academia is fiercely competitive. And also, jobs in which people, you know, feel they have the ability to do good are also extremely competitive. So we're kind of at the juncture of this really competitive space. And it's hard for people to break into academia and break into publishing. So, you know, GPI already has a number of very active programs that try to build the pipeline of researchers, such as this Global Priorities Fellowship Program, the Open Student Workshop, and a pre-doc program. But I think that also early career researchers, so once you get your PhD and now you're a postdoc or other kind of researcher, can also benefit from mentoring. So again, there may be some additional matchmaking to try to find mentors at external institutes. I think it's important to note that some of these programs are also geared towards reaching talented students who might otherwise be overlooked. And I think that's going to continue to be a part of focus at GPI in the future. Okay, so now I've told you a bit about trying to motivate the case for academic work. I've also told you a bit about my own plans for GPI. Hopefully you're interested in both of these kinds of things. What does GPI have to offer you? Well, if you are an external academic, there's the opportunity, of course, to work together on really interesting, potentially high-value research questions. I'm also trying to establish more sort of formal networks such that people can be notified when funding opportunities arise or when there's a workshop that somebody might be interested in attending. So again, please do get in touch if you're interested in either collaborating or being loosely in the network, and we can chat more about that. What about other researchers or practitioners at other institutions? Well, of course, we would like to think we contribute new research. We actually have been summarizing some of the existing papers at this website here. And if you have thoughts for other things we should be exploring, this is again where I'd be very interested in hearing from you, because you may have some thoughts based on where you work. You say, oh, wow, it would be really beneficial and really helpful if some academic work were done on this particular topic, or if there was a better model of blah, okay? So if you have ideas like that, please let us know. Great. So summing up here, I hope I've convinced you that academic research can provide stronger foundations and test theories more rigorously than more informal work, and can be really useful, especially when there are some high impact questions that you need a lot of rigor in order to answer. GPI, I think, overall has done very well for itself, considering it's only been around for 5 years. And I think that my own priorities for the next few years are largely going to be focused on building up this sort of new research stream, continuing to build up the econ team, expanding to hire psychologists, explore new topic areas. We will put out a refresh of the research agenda over the coming months. And if you're interested in working at GPI, or if you're interested in pre-doc and fellowship programs, there are some instructions here. You can go to the website, you can follow GPI on Twitter, and there's also this page for expressions of interest more broadly, especially from external academics, junior or senior, but anybody can feel free to get in touch this way as well. Okay, so I will leave it there and do some questions. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Eva. We have a lot of questions coming in. I'll start with this. You mentioned in the talk that GPI was considering expanding into new fields, psychology in particular. And I'm curious to know how you think, or how one should think about choosing which fields to expand into next.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think that there's obviously a lot of fields that could contribute to global priorities research, and I think that it's not to imply that other fields are not important by any means. We have to be, I think, a bit strategic in terms of which fields we start to expand into or explore, because it's very challenging to start with. So when you start to expand into another area, you generally start by maybe just hiring a couple of people, and then those couple of people might feel very isolated in an institute that would otherwise not have anybody to talk with. So psychology is an area where it's close enough to some stuff, both in philosophy and in economics actually, that there may be some areas of overlap where they would be able to get connected to existing research and build a domain of expertise very well in that way. Of course, they can also connect with the Department of Experimental Psychology, but I think, to answer your question, I think it's about where can we expand while not overly spreading ourselves too thin, while still having some areas of concentration. So expanding strategically, I would say.
Okay, that makes sense. So another question, which I imagine might actually just be on a lot of people's minds here, is, if you imagine I'm an aspiring researcher, maybe I've just come out of my undergrad degree. I'd like to do research, but I'm unsure whether to do that in an academic setting, or maybe just join a think tank or a research institute, or even do independent research. What kinds of characteristics or features should I look to know which path to take?
Yeah, so good question. So I think academic research, obviously any kind of research you've got to be very, very smart, generally speaking, but that's not actually the most important criterion necessarily, because you also need to be very persistent. Academics face sort of a long road And you have to be self-motivated, because unlike in other institutions where you might have, a manager, you're generally your own manager. I mean, sure, we have got line management at GPI, but generally speaking, you are still setting your own schedule. You're coming into the office when you want to come into the office. Nobody is looking over your back and saying, hey, I want this report by the end of the month. So you actually have to be the kind of person who is very self-motivated, can set deadlines for yourself, and a lot of very smart people fail on the basis of either lacking, persistence or that kind of self-motivation. I mean, there's other characteristics too, like creativity, but yeah, I think that those are the main failure modes for somebody who's thinking of going into academia. They might have a disappointing early experience and not stick with it enough. Actually, if I can say one small thing on that, I know that in general, in the EA community, a lot of times people say, oh, well, you should swap what you're doing really a lot and, fail fast, whatever. I think that may be the wrong advice for academia, because you are going to fail and you're going to have to stick with it for longer than you think in order to get successful. You may still fail in the end. Maybe, you discover in the first couple of years it's really not for you and you should do something else. But I think in order to have a good chance, you actually need to be very persistent.
That makes sense. Someone was asking about, so a feature of rigorous academic research is that it seems especially good at noticing mistakes or flaws, errors in existing research. That's part of the kind of self-correcting mechanism of academia. And so one benefit of GPR research in academia could be to look at existing ideas and scrutinize them. Another benefit could be a more kind of generative thing where it's coming up with new ideas. And I'm curious how you think about which of those benefits seems most important.
Yeah, I mean, they are both important. So I don't think that GPI will get into replications per se, but I do think that there are some areas where people might see an informally written up argument somewhere and try to really dig into it and see if there's any merit there, or whether upon closer scrutiny, it falls apart for X, Y, or Z reasons. So I think that kind of criticizing other work and building upon it would be a fit for GPI. Yeah, I mean, I think you need both, though.
Yeah, this makes sense. I guess a related question, when we're talking about rigor in academia, that can just mean that, in some sense, this kind of work has a unique quality of just being especially rigorous. Maybe it's making fewer mistakes, typically. But it seems to me like another quality of academic research compared to, for instance, more kind of think tank style research, is that it's just more credible, maybe because it's so rigorous. And I'm curious how you think about that benefit as well. Like, there's some story you could tell about, well, here are these kind of neglected but very important topics. It would be really nice if they just were taken more seriously in the world, in academia. And yeah, I'd like to know how you think about that as separate from just the quality of the work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a contribution in some sense of academic work. I mean, from my perspective, the main thing is just building up a sort of credible research base and knowing things. But of course, like, if external people look at that and then they say, okay, this gives me confidence in order to act on this, then that's, I think, going to be an important effect that has, especially from the standpoint of the effective altruist community. Yeah,
got it. Yeah, someone was asking about, so if you're trying to look at the most neglected and important areas as an academic researcher, then presumably, almost by definition, those areas are going to be the ones where the data is most scarce and you have the least existing literature. And so doesn't that just mean that there's this kind of really annoying, strict trade-off between trying to be rigorous and trying to find neglected problems?
No, I would just say that it's very hard, and I think that sometimes you have to build the data sets that you want to use. I mean, I've done that a lot in my own research. I have this, I built up this social science prediction platform with Stefano Della Vigna, who is an economist at UC Berkeley, where we're gathering a lot of data in real time about people's forecast ability. I think we're going to use that quite extensively. So, yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you just need to go out and make the data that you want to, use. Find some way of getting that. Incidentally, one small plug for that, if I may, we just launched a super forecasting panel, so you can see if you're a super forecaster there.
Okay. Okay, a question I'm just selfishly interested to ask. I think you briefly mentioned expanding into work that touches on AI. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you don't have in mind just doing technical alignment research, because there are organizations which do that. So I'm really interested to know what that actually could look like.
Sure, yeah. So it's interesting. I think, there have been discussions both on the philosophy and econ team within GPI on what we could potentially contribute here. And there's still a lot of uncertainties. One thing that surprised me is that the philosophy team seemed to be actually more optimistic of having something to say, in the sense of being able to look at other arguments people had made, because sometimes the loudest speakers on both sides of the AI safety debate are making more informal arguments, and maybe digging into them more would, potentially shed some light. So the philosophy side has been thinking of going down that route a bit. The econ side is still a little bit exploring what it could say. Maybe some things relating to AI and growth, maybe relating to some things involving, mechanism design, but it's still, I think, a little bit unclear. So we'll see as things develop.
Okay, exciting. Someone's asking about whether it could be good for academics working on global priorities research to actively engage with media, with journalists, for instance, presumably to kind of broaden the reach of their research. And if so, how do you go about doing that without, sensationalizing or misinterpreting the research?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think the right time to do that is once something typically is, very, very ready for that. So it's at the point of publication. Sometimes people will popularize, a working paper, a preprint, and that can be valuable too when the topic is very, sensitive and very. It's important to get it out quickly. Like there were a lot of preprints for COVID papers, for example. They got a lot of media attention, and probably for good reason. But I think how to go about it. So there are often media offices at various universities that can help with putting out, your research to certain media outlets. That's one very well-established way of doing it. Of course, if you happen to know any journalists, that's also great to reach out. I think few people will hold it against you if you are careful in what you say and, stick to the things that are actually you've got some kind of grounding for. And also if you, it's a little bit easier if it's already published, because then it has sort of the stamp of peer review on it, right? But yeah, the only thing I would discourage is if you're working on something and you've got some early results and you're like, okay, I'm going to go to the media with this. That's probably pretty risky for you. You might do more research and find that your original results don't hold up, and yeah, that would be a problem. So yeah, avoid that and avoid sensationalizing.
Okay, cool. That's useful. This question might be looking for some hot takes, I'm not sure, but it's about whether there are features of academia which you think EA in general could benefit from just by adopting more. And I guess on the other hand, are there features of academia in general where it makes sense for EA to kind of remain distinct from?
So I mean, I think that the Global Priorities Institute does academic work on global priorities that could end up. I would like to still make a distinction between that and the EA community as a whole, because the EA community, we don't have any control over. In principle, could go off and do some wild and crazy things in the future. We're trying to do foundational research on how an agent can do the most good. That's not to say that that will always necessarily match everything that goes on everywhere in the EA space. In terms of what can be learned from each other, I think that one thing that academic research does have to contribute on this front is just this awareness of how hard it is sometimes to know things, and some epistemic modesty that comes with that. I think that sometimes there's a backlash amongst academics to some things that EAs are saying because of the language that is used that expresses a high degree of confidence on something that hasn't been shown really at all in any kind of rigorous way. And so I think there could be a little bit, if you're thinking of how to convince others of your message, making sure to appropriately state the amount of confidence you can have on this, or show your reasoning and be very careful about that, is probably the right way to go for people to sort of really hear your message. Because I think academics, maybe because of this sort of history of very rigorous work and this emphasis on high credibility, have sort of a knee-jerk reaction against something that sounds kind of, well, not grounded on very much, right? So you want to be very careful, I think, in how you discuss things and discuss your own uncertainty.
Yeah, great. A question which occurs to me, I remember in the talk you're just mentioning how much interest you're getting in these workshops that GPL is running and these visitor programs. And I can really just totally imagine if I'm, let's say, an economist, but I'm not specifically working on low priorities research. Maybe that's because I'm constrained by just my circumstances, the place where I work. I can imagine it just sounds really exciting and kind of obviously interesting to work on these topics, just thinking about these kind of at a very high level, how to do the most good. That's really fantastic. I'm curious whether you have an impression of just how much kind of latent demand there is for doing this kind of work once the institutional capacity, I guess, exists for it.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of latent demand for this, and I think maybe part of the reason there hasn't been as much engagement from external academics on the econ side is that people haven't necessarily known that, hey, this is a thing where, this is a thing that exists, first of all, and this is a thing where people do care about rigor, and they do have they are keeping to academic standards, and we can have a reasonable conversation about things. Like, I think that, it's always hard when you have an institution and you're building out to new fields to then get the attention of other people in those fields and say that there's something for them there too. Of course, people don't necessarily know about it at first, so hopefully that'll change over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess a related question is, if I'm an early stage researcher in academia, how much should I be thinking about just trying to build up expertise for myself in general, career capital you might call it, in order to do the important work later, versus how much should I be thinking about targeting my research more deliberately on trying to at least have an impact early on?
Yeah, there's not going to be a general answer to that question, I think. It depends a lot on your circumstances. It depends on what field you're in. It depends on what kinds of research questions sort of fall within your purview and which ones you're considering. I have seen people go in both directions, where they say, I'm just going to play the game, get tenure, and then work on topics that are maybe more important, but that are harder to publish. I have seen people do that. I think that's a hard road to try to do. But it's also hard to say, look, I'm going to start out by working on topics that I think are most impactful, even if they don't publish well. And then, of course, you have to face the consequences of that. So, which of those two hard roads is better is hard to say without more specifics. I think it's going to really depend on what exactly you're considering and what your situation is. Yeah. I mean, it is hard to sort of also value impact while you're doing your work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Someone was asking about I guess, one kind of theory of change for global priorities research in academia, where the story is that you get lots of kind of big if true but quite vague ideas from outside of academia, maybe even within the kind of EA context, just people throwing around ideas. And then one role for academic work can be to take those ideas and make them precise, and then figure out whether they go through. And if they do go through, then you've now got a more kind of a better grounding for that idea. So I guess one question is, does that sound right to you? And another question is, are there any other kinds of ways you see this research having impact? And that'll be the last question, I guess.
Yeah, no, great last question. I mean, I think that is a thing that academic research can contribute to. I don't think all of the big if true questions come from outside of academia, though. You know, I think long-termism, for example, started within academia. So, you know, I think that academia does have a role of trying to more rigorously test things and see how much they can withstand scrutiny. But the ideas can come from any source, both external and internal.
That's great. Okay, please join me in thanking Eva Vivalt.